Hey Jordan,
Hey Arch, how are you?
pretty good. How you going?
Yeah, not too bad. Bit of a slow news week this week, but we've got a few things to talk about.
Yeah.
I wanted to start with this critical technologies stuff. So on Wednesday, Scott Morrison announced the federal government's new critical technologies framework and action plan, which he says aims to manage economic opportunities of critical technologies with their national security risk. So it's a kind of national action plan, or at least framework for covering things like quantum computing, artificial technology, cybersecurity, autonomous vehicles. And it really seems the focus of this thing is to, interesting stuff, right? But the focus of the thing, it seems to be on protecting and developing Australian capabilities in those areas and countering foreign interference, technology theft, and yeah, making sure that we have domestic capabilities and so on. What was your take on that?
Yeah, it was an interesting announcement. I think you know, probably mixed feelings. Like I think generally speaking, I think it's always I'm sort of always happy enough when there's some some proactivity around technology from government, particularly emerging technology, that they're sort of there's a sense that they're sort of thinking and understand the impact and implication for kind of our national society and our economy and so from that perspective, the fact that there was a sort of a plan, or well,
Mhm.
in government terminology, a blueprint and an action plan
Yeah.
was, I think, good. And and particularly around, the security element, I think, for a long time, there've been sort of, industry voices saying, well, we've got these technologies coming down the road, which are going to be increasingly critical, AI, um, quantum computing, blockchain, all of these things that have
Mm.
potential security, risks to manage that underneath them. And so from that side of things, I think that's an important thing, and a thing to
Yeah,
recognize.
and there are often things like a lot of these things are, they require coordinated approaches, right, between academia, industry, government. We need a position on how the whole country is engaging in international discussions and so on. It's not the kind of thing that just single actors. One organization is not going to solve cybersecurity, right? You need, yeah, yeah, all sorts of things to line up.
Yeah, exactly. The sort of almost cliched sort of team sport kind of thing is certainly true for cybersecurity, but a lot of these technologies, like you say, there's so many different parties to it. So yeah, I think that kind of proactivity around those security risks is valid, and was good to see. The way the mixed feelings come from was around sort of it was interesting to see the framing of it, and it felt like it was perhaps um, more narrowly framed than I would have liked. I mean, we were talking about these technologies and how they play out in terms of national interest, and it was very much a sort of, to me, it looked like a very inside out view around, like, how do we protect these technologies? How do they relate to sort of national security and our economic prosperity? And so, there was a lot of language around, the defense of sort of our value set and, sort of liberal democratic values.
Mm,
And that sort of set, and I think it's important to also sort of recognize that the announcement was sort of in the context of a broader dialogue, and the sort of, the prime minister linked it to AUKUS and that kind, all of
mm,
those sort of
mm.
defense announcements and strategic partnerships. And I think that's kind of maybe colored a little bit about, or narrowed, how we're talking about these technologies.
Mm.
National interest is certainly about national security, and it's certainly about economic prosperity, but there's also, how do these technologies shape our society, and how do they influence the way we interact with each other as individuals, but also just our individual human rights as well. And
Yeah.
and it was interesting to see actually that, in the action plan itself, there was actually a picture on page 9 of what is national interest, and it was sort of national interest comprising of three things, comprising of national security, economic interest, and social cohesion. But very little about the sort of that I could see in the action plan kind of spoke more so to that third element around social cohesion. And like I said, it was this very sort of inside outward look of like, well, this positioning of we need to defend these technologies, and that's where the security stuff comes from. It's like, how do we make sure these technologies are free from foreign interference and whatnot? And then also, how do we build our own technology set and have commercial development and strike partnerships with, India, for example, is one of the announceables around this plan was around a sort of a partnership with India around co-developing critical technologies and attracting, venture capital and so forth. But a lot of this is also about how are we going to allow these technologies to be used, and how will we use these technologies as institutions, as societies within our own country? Because arguably they are critical and they will shape how we interact with each other, and they will shape our rights and how those are treated. So
and that's the critical question, right? Which is just not present in the announcement, and not present other than one diagram in the plan, right? That, how do we think about and deploy these technologies at home? How will they affect our lives, our relationships? How do they affect our power structures and power relationships between us? And it's a bit kind of, the assumption, right, is that we're going to develop them. In fact, we must develop them because it's framed in this competition kind of, if we don't, then the other guys will and will have lost kind of framing, and which does not leave a lot of room for kind of critical discussion about, well, what are these technologies? How will they affect us? And do we even want them, right? Which is like a question that's never asked in any technology debate, right? Like, is this technology actually something that is useful that we want, or is it gonna be harmful or damaging, or, is it something? Yeah.
I mean, there's some great. I mean, there was, it's interesting because when you see the high level framing of it, so for example, when the Prime Minister announced the plan, it was sort of the language, the speech, and the forward to the plan. The language in that is, very much about, we must, ensure that the critical technologies in their application uphold the rule of law and human rights. But it's, again, it's like, this is about sort of being pitched as a, well, because we need to do it our way, because if not, we'll have sort of foreign interference, or there'll be a misapplication of these technologies by other parts of the world that don't hold our value set. But we can see clearly in Western democracies that even the way we apply these technologies within our own societies can threaten the rule of law and human rights. And we've seen that, and there are countless examples that we've spoken about previously that reflect that. And so that's, there could be more on that. And I think the closest I could see within the plan that sort of got to that was, I think Pillar 5 of the plan was about ensuring that policies, regulations, and standards are fit for purpose. But then even if you dig into that, the first kind of commentary around that is about, I was just going to say, the first comment about that sits underneath that is a sort of talking about the deregulation agenda. So it's not quite necessarily what we're thinking.
And we've already framed the purpose as, state competition on these technologies, not benefiting communities or individuals locally. So.
But there was a related thing that I wanted to kind of talk about a little bit as well, because what I think one of the interesting quotes, I think again that came out around the announcement, was about the whole point of this is about signaling. That there was language about signaling, like this plan is about signaling how we want these technologies to work and do what we want them to do. And so I think, that's the missed opportunity, is like, well, there are many things we can signal. Yes, we want to signal their criticality to national security and, our commercial success and economic success, but can we also signal to industry, to academia, impacts on humans, because that we would like to see that. But speaking of signaling, there was a sort of an associated announcement around this around this critical technologies action plan, which was specifically a set of principles around supply chain for critical technology. So the government has announced 10 voluntary principles to assist Australian businesses to adopt critical technologies and get more confidence out of it. And the idea being that, you know, these principles should be applied by organisations to their supply chain when they're dealing with critical technologies. They've sort of split the principles across 3 areas, one being kind of security by design. So some principles that sort of speak to, you know, making sure that your suppliers have the right security measures in place. There's a second sort of a category around transparency. So, you know, having principles that basically go to understanding who your suppliers are and you know, what they're all about. And then the third one being around kind of autonomy and integrity, which, you know, again speaks to, like, you know, who are your suppliers, what are their ethical standards, you know, how their integrity, like, are they subject to foreign interference? So these sort of 10 principles that the government's issued, they're entirely voluntary, which is in and of itself a kind of an interesting discussion point, because there's, you know, an argument that could be sort of like made into standards or regulatory frameworks. But that was really the essence of my question that I wanted to throw to you. Is we see often in this space, digital, you know, in the digital data protection, security, privacy space, we often see this kind of use of principles. Like there's often you know, a set of principles issued, and I'm really curious to hear your thoughts around, like, what is the value of a set of principles? Like, then they're not mandatory; they're voluntary, as the government has said. Is that worth anything?
Yeah, it's a good question, right? I mean, it's worth something, I imagine, in that signaling context, right? Like, where, you know, at the very least, we're saying, you know, here are the things that we think are important. How important do you think they are if you're not going to enforce them or require them? You know, kind of compromises that message maybe. But I mean, yeah, it's interesting because, I mean, all of privacy regulation pretty much is principles based, right? But it's not just principles based. It's backed up by penalties and enforcement mechanisms and so on. So I think talking in generalized language and talking in principled language is critical for anything that's as broad as, say, privacy protections, or as fast moving as technology regulation. That you need to, you know, you can't regulate specific actions or technologies because the ball just moves so quickly that the regulation comes up, you know, falls behind. So I think, you know, in that sense, kind of talking and starting with principles is critical. But the problem, the problem, and what you know, this seems to possibly likely to fall foul of, is that when people think of principles or ethics as an alternative to regulation or enforcement, right? So, you know, I mean, this is a classic. Is happening all over the world in AI, artificial intelligence ethics principles, right? We have more artificial intelligence ethics frameworks than you can shake a stick at, but very few or very little that's actually like enforceable in a concrete way. And so, you know, I'd question the extent to which, which, you know, another set of principles is really going to shift the needle, I suppose. I think it's useful. It's a useful signaling exercise. It's useful to kind of move us in a right direction. It's probably useful as a precursor to regulation to set industry expectations, and then, you know, the next stage is to say, okay, well, we'll enforce some elements of this.
And I think an important bit of context for this is that you know, there is also a raft of kind of critical infrastructure legislation that is being kind of moved through the parliament as we speak. And so there's I guess there is in this context a little bit of, you know, sort of some teeth to this around, you know, the complements maybe the principles. I mean, it's a curious thing to set up principles around it. So supply chain security, it seems like something that is serious enough, and we've seen the implications of poor supply chain security. It seems something serious enough that if there is need to build greater resilience and strength in that in that area of the economy, that it be something that's be a bit enforced with a measure that's more concrete than principles. But yeah, there is that broader context of other legislation, other obligations that are being kind of designed in parallel with this.
Yeah, I think that makes sense.
Yes. It's a sort of related one, but I wanted to kind of move on to our next topic, which I thought this was quite fascinating. It was a speech by Tim Watts, who's the Shadow Assistant Cybersecurity Minister. He made a speech during the week, and it was really about, I guess, the nexus of democracy and tech policy, and I guess competing visions, which are maybe more autocratic.
I love this. This is so down my alley.
Yeah, I thought it would be. So essentially, some of the things that Tim Watts was saying in this speech was, he was basically kind of taking to task the sort of libertarian vision for the internet, the sort of the view that the sort of platitudes of open, free, let the internet be an open space, and that will kind of preserve our human values and our human rights and our freedoms. And he was kind of essentially drawing attention to the fact that, well, that hasn't gone particularly well. Like if we look in Western democracies, the sort of the unrestrained, unregulated notion of an internet hasn't been necessarily a thing that has led to good outcomes for users of the internet. And we have this the open view, the open, secure view of the internet was always sort of positioned as a sort of as a preferred model to what more autocratic states might do, where the government essentially exerts much more control and there's much more sort of censorship and access to what people are doing on the internet, and much more stringent controls. And the gap being called out between those two visions is sort of the heart of, I think, some of what Tim Watts was saying. And I think what was interesting about it is because we in Australia we've had a sort of an international cyber policy agenda as well, which has been very much about, like, let's promote this openness and this free, this kind of free internet. But it's kind of now getting to a point where it was like, well, what does that mean specifically? Because if we just say, don't do anything, let it run as it runs, well, we've seen this sort of, the dominance of, big tech. We've seen kind of things play out that have meant, privacy has been infringed, human rights have been infringed, there's misinformation. Even our very sort of civil society is not necessarily being preserved by that model. There are factors, whether that whether that's just the monopolistic kind of nature of big tech and the ability to scale through technology that has allowed them to do that. But regardless, it is not a model that is necessarily favorable. So we need to think of a different way to do that. And his case, I think, is to say, well, we clearly need some more. We need more scaffolding. We can't just say we want it to be open, free, and liberal, and for liberal values to shine, because that doesn't happen organically.
And then hope it develops in that direction.
And so he's kind of making this case of, well, what is that next level of detail? What are the things that we need to see that we can do? And what's your take on that? And then this kind of idea that some of these intentions need to translate into more concrete things.
I love it, and I think we need to talk about this more often. So often we just kind of ignore the drivers behind technology and the interests that it's being built to serve, and just hope that the things that are important to us are reflected in these things that people have designed with particular goals in mind, and they're not necessarily the same goals that we have. The internet is a built environment, built by humans, built by largely large corporations these days. You know, very early internet, less so. It was more an enthusiast kind of scenario. But these days, the internet that we experience, all of the platforms we experience, are built by big organizations with profit motives, and they're influenced by whatever parties, be them democratic or autocratic governments or other, you know, commercial entities or whoever else. They're influenced by whichever parties put the effort in, right? Whoever shows up. So this idea that, you know, we can create a magical world in cyberspace and just expect it, or any technology, actually, this applies to any technology, but just expect a technology to develop in the way that we want it without putting the effort in, or without, you know, paying attention to the other driving factors is fantasy. So we need to, I'm right on board with Tim. I think, you know, we need to continually think very seriously about, you know, how do we influence the technologies that that shape our lives to be, you know, the way that we want them. And the first step there is to recognize, I think, that these are built technologies, right? Nothing is necessary about, you know, you log into Facebook and you can like things, and you can, all of that entire interaction, everything you see is designed for a specific purpose, which is to, you know, promote your engagement, or it's, you know, the company's profit motive. So so
are you telling me that the Garden of Eden didn't have like buttons and they weren't just there?
Exactly right. They were delivered from on high. There is something natural and true and inevitable about a like button. So, and I mean, this is something I think that privacy, the privacy profession has been conscious of for a while. I mean, people talk a lot about privacy by design, and the importance of, you know, if you have a particular value that you want a system to reflect, it needs to start from the start. It needs to start at the design phase, or even before that, right? What behaviors are we supporting or not? What are the affordances in the system? And it needs to flow through, right? It can't be, you know, and it's really hard to do what we're trying to do now, which is like force a particular set of values onto a system that's already existing. But I mean, it's also an incredibly hard problem, right? I don't have solutions. I don't think, you know, Tim Watts or anyone else does really either. I think the challenge is to push in this direction, right? And to start thinking more critically about the technologies that we're using, start, you know, articulating the values that we want them to reflect, and critically evaluating them, and building new technologies that push towards those values. So like, it's something that I think the Australian Human Rights Commission, Ed Sandu was the commissioner there, led this report around human rights and technology. And it's something I think that's quite a good articulation of that problem, right? That we're developing all these technologies, they're going to have impacts on people. Kind of harks back to our previous conversation as well about the critical technologies, right? That we need mechanisms for assessing and, you know, evaluating these things that put the human rights or the individual impacts on a same level as the economic or the you know, the other imperatives. You know, and there's a lot of work that's going on there around, you know, human rights impacts assessments and design considerations and so on. But yeah, I don't know, it's not an easy problem to solve, right? It's a really thorny one. We can't just turn around the nature of the internet all at once. Did you have thoughts on that, or you know, what's the approach? Because there's the local, there's, you know, I'm focused on, you know, law and individuals and you know, the human rights report. I suppose there's a role for Australia as well on a global stage in influencing those kinds of discussions.
Yeah, I think so. I think you know, I think what this has kind of highlighted is that, you know, it makes it a more tangible conversation and a real conversation. So we're talking about, you know, how do we want the internet at large to operate, but really what we can control and influence is, how do these, what are the policy prescriptions? What's the regulatory framework? How do these technologies work within our own countries? And how do we kind of set a bit of a model for what we believe? So if we're, harking back to sort of the Prime Minister's comments around critical technologies, it's like, well, if we're trying to embed a set of liberal democratic values, we can do that with the way these technologies work within our own environment. So it's one thing to be an ambassador on the world stage and say this is how the internet should work, but that becomes a very difficult conversation because it's large and abstract. But we have conversations at the moment locally within our own country around everything from how does the review of the Privacy Act, how do we manage the risks for children and vulnerable people? What's kind of the online safety environment look like? And we have specific pieces of legislation around all of this that we have debated and put through. And so to me, it kind of crystallizes that we have an opportunity to kind of get those things right and embed that value set. If we believe in human rights, if we believe in kind of protecting the individuals from harm, let's make that happen through these pieces of legislation. And let's have those debates around safeguards. That we talk about that a lot, but when we have these, when we introduce these new measures, are the safeguards in place? Let's get all of that right, and then we have I think we have what Tim Watts is kind of talking about, which is we have detail and we have data and we have specific success stories that we can talk about on the world stage. And we've seen already that when we introduce these measures like the online privacy code, they make international headlines. When the OAIC makes a determination against Clearview AI, that makes international headlines. So this is a way for us, I think, to shape that broader international dialogue.
Yeah, it's interesting. We're kind of we're well positioned, I think, in Australia to almost be a policy test bed for some of these things as well. Like we have this great opportunity to try things out or lead the world in some of these ways. And some, I don't agree with the way that we lead the world in a lot of contexts, like the news media bargaining code's a really good example of this, leading the world, making global news, presenting a model for regulation. I don't like the model, but it's still that particular one, but it's a really good demonstration of this opportunity. And it really, for me, it really emphasizes the importance of our domestic policy debates. So the importance of having input and getting the Privacy Act review right, for example, because a lot of that's about Australia playing catch up to global standards, but there's real opportunities there to implement changes that can be world leading or can change, that other countries can build on. So for me that thought makes it really exciting being a part of those kinds of domestic policy debates because we're all grappling with the same problems, right? And we're all
absolutely. Well, speaking of, I guess, when local things collide with broader international movements, wanted to talk about the decision by Adelaide City Council around its CCTV network and facial recognition technology. Keen to get your thoughts on this because it ties into some broader conversations. So the Adelaide City Council is replacing its CCTV network, so they're essentially upgrading it, and it will have the capability for facial and number plate recognition. But interestingly, they passed an amendment around this new infrastructure that will prevent police from accessing the facial recognition technology until there are some laws or some sort of safeguards around people's privacy. I was really curious to get your take on this because, there's a couple of elements here. One, the fact that the council is sort of, making these decisions around the usage of facial recognition technology, but also just tapping into that broader movement that we've seen around facial recognition in the last few weeks. But what do you reckon?
Yeah, I found this story so fascinating, right? It's on the one hand, it's kind of small time stuff, right? It's a local council in a you know, I mean, you know, it's capital city in Australia, but it's, you know, not a very large city. It's a lovely small town. I was born there. But so, but it reflects, yeah, it's fascinating in that, like, who is making these decisions about access to facial recognition and who gets to use it, and how it reflects these kind of international or like global discussions, right? We were talking the other week about Clearview and about Facebook's decision to abandon, you know, facial recognition or decommission their auto tagging facial recognition tool on their platform, and how those things contribute to momentum against this this technology, or a growing recognition about the ways in which the technology can be really harmful. And to see, I don't know whether, you know, I wasn't at the council meeting, but I can just see a direct line from those high profile news stories, that growing momentum, into that council room, and people asking the question, hey, what controls do we have around this? Are we comfortable with deploying this in this way? Should we give it a bit more scrutiny? And it leads to these kinds of decisions. So, you know, I think it's a really, really fascinating and valuable kind of instance of how those kind of the big picture stories, that momentum, I think, is really taking root. I also think it's fascinating that it's the local council, the City of Adelaide's local council, that's denying the local police access to facial recognition cameras, because it's something that a lot of people don't, I think, realize, that how I mean, local councils in general make so many decisions that are so impactful on our lives, and one of them is the deployment of surveillance cameras. There's a huge proportion of, at least in Victoria, New South Wales, South Australia, there's a huge proportion of the video cameras you see in the public are funded. They're usually funded by either Commonwealth or state governments, but they're deployed and managed by the local council, and the police force has access into those CCTV cameras directly. So largely, it's managed by the local council for use by police. But it puts the local councils in this really interesting middle position, where they actually, you know, are responsible for, to some extent, responsible for the deployment and the maintenance, and they have this kind of power to insert themselves and kind of make these decisions and influence the use of the technology. So I think it's a really interesting kind of leverage point, right? Like, or, you know, if I'm an activist who's concerned about CCTV camera, you know, surveillance in my town, start with the local council. They might have more influence than you think.
Yeah. Speak to, you know, Jeff or Sandy or whoever it is down the
Yeah,
road.
exactly right. Around the
councillor.
Yeah.
It's funny because we've got local council elections, you know, happening fairly shortly. So I'm seeing all the
ask them
corporates
what
and
their
billboards,
policy is on
I
surveillance.
think I need to ask them what their policy is on facial recognition and surveillance. And
yeah,
but I think that's really neat, because it's kind of like, particularly in the way we've had this conversation, it's literally like that, you know, that phrase of, you know, think global, act local. It's like we're talking about issues that are, you know, global and national and in nature, but they have this sort of real local relevance, and that you can influence them. So I think that's, you know,
yeah, and it's beautiful, right? Because so often these, you know, talking about, I don't know, policy decisions that Facebook makes, so disempowering, right? I can't influence that, but all of these things, they funnel down to real impacts on individuals' lives, and, you know, in a lot of cases, like, we can have real influence on those things. But
I think that's a really neat way to wrap up our chat, because it sort of ties in from everything that we've been talking about around, you know, how do we make this real on that, in that larger scale. And I think that's a good way to finish it off. What do you reckon?
Yeah, absolutely. Let's wrap it up there, and I'll talk to you again next week.
Awesome. Thanks, Jordan. See you next time.
Thanks, mate. See ya.